A simple mechanic from a small town stumbled upon an old prison truck deep in the forest, rusted and covered in moss. He thought it was just scrap and metal inside, but what he saw made him freeze in shock. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The rain had stopped just before dawn, leaving the Alabama woods soaked and shining. Every pine needle dripped. Every hollow smelled of wet bark and earth. The fog clung low over the ground, sliding across the road like breath. Marcus Ellery's old pickup groaned as it climbed the muddy incline, its headlights slicing through the mist. He wasn't in a hurry. There was never any reason to be these days. Out here, time moved like sap, slow, quiet, and heavy. He'd lived alone for almost 5 years now in a house that used to belong to his uncle, tucked near the edge of the forest where the county road turned to gravel and then to nothing. It was a crooked little place, leaning against the trees as if the woods were the only thing keeping it upright. Inside, it smelled of motor oil and old wood smoke. His tools filled half the living room. The other half was mostly silence. There was a photograph on the wall. His wife, Celia, smiling with a wrench in her hand, grease smudged across her cheek. She'd been gone for 7 years, taken by a blood clot that came without warning one afternoon while she was helping him rebuild a transmission. He never remarried, never tried. Instead, he worked, fixed, and stayed still. People in town called him that quiet mechanic out by the ridge. He didn't mind. He fixed tractors and mowers, the kinds of machines everyone else had given up on. He'd always liked broken things. They were honest. They didn't pretend to be whole. And in some quiet, unspoken way, he felt they understood him. That morning, Marcus was headed toward a neighbor's place to pick up a busted generator. The storm had knocked out half the county's power, and he'd promised to take a look. He drove slow, the old tires sinking into the mud, the radio whispering static with half a gospel tune beneath it. The sky was still gray when he saw something strange on the side of the road, a glint of metal buried in the ditch. At first, he thought it was just a rusted panel from a tractor or a fallen sign. This part of the county was littered with old junk, relics from when there'd been more people, more work, more everything. But as he passed, something about the shape caught his eye. It wasn't jagged or bent like scrap. It was flat, thick, deliberate. He pulled over and stepped out. The air was cold against his skin, damp enough to taste. He climbed down the slope and pushed aside the ferns. Beneath the slick mud, a sheet of dull gray metal gleamed faintly. He crouched, ran his fingers along it. It was solid, heavy. He could feel the faint curve of something larger beneath the surface, something that went deeper than the ditch itself. The markings were almost gone, eaten by rust and time, but under the mud he could just make out faded white paint. Letters. He squinted. The first word was half missing, the rest worn away, but one part remained clear. Depth of Corps. He sat back on his heels, staring at it. Department of Corrections. A prison transport, maybe? What the hell was a prison truck doing out here, halfway swallowed by the forest? There hadn't been a correctional route through these hills in decades. He looked around. The road was empty, the forest still, only the soft hum of wind through wet leaves. Marcus ran a hand over his stubble and exhaled. Whatever this was, it had been here a long time. The metal was pitted deep, the color of blood and iron. Moss had grown into the seams like stitches holding a wound shut. He stood up, brushing mud from his jeans. He should have turned around and gone home right then. He told himself it wasn't his problem, that it could wait, but curiosity worked through him like an itch he couldn't ignore. He'd seen a lot of broken machines in his life, but this wasn't the kind of thing you stumbled on by chance. The rain started again, light at first, then heavier. He covered the spot with a few branches, more out of instinct than reason, and walked back to his truck. His boots left dark prints in the mud. By the time he reached the cab, his hands were trembling, not from cold, but from something else, an unease he couldn't name. The drive back felt longer. The fog thickened, swallowing the road. He turned on the wipers, though they did little good. As he approached the ridge, the radio cut to static again, then briefly caught a signal, some local station out of Montgomery. The announcer was talking about a lost transport convoy from the 80s, but the interference drowned out the rest. Marcus frowned, tapped the dial, but the voice faded into the hum. He parked outside his house, sat for a long minute without cutting the engine. The windshield was streaked with rain, and through it he could see the tree line, dark and shifting, the same place where that glint of metal had waited under the earth. It felt like the forest itself had eyes. Inside, he hung his jacket by the door and washed the mud from his hands. The house was colder than usual. He lit the wood stove, then went out to the small workshop that leaned against the back wall of the house. The place was cluttered with tools and engines in varying states of disrepair. He picked up a carburetor, tried to focus on fixing it, but his thoughts kept circling back to that patch of rusted steel. In a drawer beneath the workbench, wrapped in an old rag, was his father's military dog tag, Henry Ellery, U.S. Army. The metal was tarnished but still legible. Marcus turned it over in his fingers, feeling the shallow grooves of the letters. His father had vanished when Marcus was a boy. The official story was that he drowned while fishing on Lake Greeley, but there'd been whispers back then, rumors about something that happened at the county correctional transport yard. He'd never known the details. His mother refused to talk about it. He slid the tag back into the drawer and shut it. The clock on the wall ticked loud in the silence. Outside, the rain eased to a drizzle. He poured himself coffee, stood by the window, and watched the fog crawl back into the woods. As dusk settled, he caught himself staring at the tree line again. He imagined that slab of metal, buried and waiting, the letters almost erased. It had probably been there since before he was born. He wondered who'd driven it, what it carried, why no one ever found it. Then a darker thought crept in. What if someone had found it and decided to leave it there? He tried to shake it off. He turned off the light, went to bed, and lay staring at the ceiling. The night was thick and quiet, except for the occasional crack of branches outside. Sometime past midnight, he thought he heard something else, faint, metallic, like the echo of a heavy door closing far away. He sat up, heart pounding, listening. The sound didn't come again. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it wasn't. When morning came, the world looked new again, washed clean by the rain. But the image of that metal plate wouldn't leave him. Over breakfast, he kept glancing toward the woods as if expecting to see it from his window. The air felt charged, like the moment before thunder. He packed a thermos of coffee, grabbed his old shovel, a pry bar, and a flashlight. He didn't bother telling anyone where he was going. There was no one to tell. Before leaving, he paused on the porch, staring into the forest. The trees stood tall and quiet, their trunks dark with moisture, their roots sunk deep into the red clay. He climbed into his truck, started the engine, and drove back toward the ridge. The sky was pale and colorless. Birds scattered from the road as his tires crunched over gravel. Every turn brought him deeper into the silence. When he reached the spot, he parked and cut the engine. The air was still. He could hear the soft drip of water from the trees. The ditch looked the same as yesterday, only the mud had thickened. The branches he'd left had shifted slightly, as if something beneath them had moved. Marcus stood for a long time, staring down at the half-buried shape. Then he knelt, rolled up his sleeves, and pushed the shovel into the earth. The metal rang faintly, a dull, hollow sound that echoed deeper than he expected. He paused, breathing hard. Beneath the mud, he could feel the edge of something vast. He worked for hours, clearing soil, cutting through roots. The more he uncovered, the more he realized it wasn't a simple wreck. The sides were reinforced steel, the kind used for armored transport. The door was heavy, sealed tight, its hinges fused with rust. When the shovel hit glass, he stopped. A cracked windshield, barely visible beneath decades of grime. Inside, darkness. He sat back in the mud, panting. The forest around him was silent. Even the birds had gone quiet. Marcus wiped sweat from his face and looked at what he'd uncovered. He didn't know yet what it was or who it belonged to, but one thing was certain. It hadn't been meant to be found. The wind shifted through the trees, carrying the faint scent of rust and something older, something like secrets unearthed from a grave. He stood, the shovel heavy in his hand, and whispered to no one, "Tomorrow." Then he turned and walked back toward his truck, leaving the forest to its silence, unaware that with each step he was walking closer to a story that had been buried for nearly 40 years. When he reached home, the first stars were starting to appear behind the drifting clouds. He locked his tools away, washed his hands again, and stared into the basin as brown water swirled down the drain. The forest was quiet beyond the window, but he felt its presence like a pulse, the kind that waits, the kind that remembers. And as night fell fully across the Alabama hills, Marcus Ellery, mechanic, widower, and son of a man who'd vanished into rumor, lay awake knowing that tomorrow he'd go back and dig deeper. Whatever slept beneath that steel, it was calling to be found. The next morning broke in a haze of pale light that filtered through the pines like smoke. The storm had rinsed everything clean, but the air still hung heavy with moisture thick enough to taste. Marcus woke before sunrise, though it wasn't rest that had woken him. It was the weight of what he'd seen yesterday, the cold shimmer of metal beneath the mud, the ghost of letters spelling Department of Corrections. He sat on the edge of his bed for a long while, listening to the creak of the old house as it shifted with the damp. He didn't make coffee, didn't eat, just pulled on his boots, his jacket, and gathered what he knew he'd need. The shovel, the crowbar, a coil of rope, gloves, and a heavy-duty flashlight that hadn't been used since his days repairing cell towers. The forest was still gray when he stepped outside. The clouds had broken in thin streaks, and mist pooled low around the trees, moving like something alive. His boots sank into the wet ground as he crossed the yard. The air smelled faintly of cedar and ash from the night's fire. As he reached the truck, he glanced once toward the ridge where the forest thickened into shadow. It was waiting for him. He could feel it. The drive out was quiet. The old pickup rattled along the narrow road, each turn taking him deeper into a place most people avoided. He'd always liked it that way. The isolation, the sense that the world forgot you once you crossed a certain line. But today the stillness felt different. Not peaceful, but watchful. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. He parked in the same spot as before and killed the engine. For a moment, he just sat there, gripping the steering wheel. Part of him whispered that he should leave it buried, that whatever was down there had stayed hidden for a reason. But another part, the stubborn, practical part that had spent a lifetime fixing what others abandoned, wouldn't let it go. He climbed out, slinging the tools over his shoulder. The mud squelched underfoot as he made his way down the slope. The branches he'd used to cover the spot had shifted again, scattered slightly, as if an animal had pawed at them. He crouched, brushed them aside, and there it was. The dull gray surface streaked with orange rust, shining faintly beneath a sheen of moisture. He set down his bag and got to work. The first shovelful came easy, the soil soft from the rain. But as he dug deeper, the ground turned stubborn, tangled with roots that seemed determined to hold on. He cut through them methodically, the blade of the shovel ringing against the buried metal. The sound echoed strangely, hollow and low, like something calling from under the ground. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chill. Time blurred. Minutes became hours. The forest stayed unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. By midday, he had uncovered the full curve of a door, thick steel bolted at the edges with a seam running down the center. Near the top, half eaten by rust, were the faint remnants of words. He leaned closer, tracing the letters with his glove. Department of Corrections. Transport Unit 47. A chill ran through him. He stepped back, surveying the shape beneath the mud. It wasn't just a wall. It was the side of an entire vehicle. The roof slanted slightly upward, buried deep into the embankment. Judging by the size, it was a prison transport bus, the kind built to carry a dozen men behind bars and armor plate. It had been here a long time, decades maybe, slowly devoured by the earth. He circled the wreck, testing the ground for collapse. Near the front end, a patch of soil gave way beneath his boot, revealing cracked glass. The windshield, blackened by grime, reflected his face like a ghost. His heart thudded. He didn't know why he expected it to be empty. Maybe because it should have been. Maybe because the idea of anything still inside felt too impossible. But deep down, he knew. The smell that leaked through the rusted seams wasn't just rot or mold. It was older than that, heavier. A smell the body recognized before the mind did. He grabbed the crowbar and wedged it into the seam of the door. The metal resisted at first, creaking softly, then let out a groan that echoed through the trees. It was the sound of something that hadn't moved in decades. Marcus braced his foot against the frame and pulled harder. The hinge cracked. Another pull, harder still, and the seal gave way with a scream of tearing rust. A rush of air burst out, damp and sour. He coughed, covering his mouth. The smell was thick. Stale fuel, rot, and something underneath it all that twisted the stomach. He stepped back, waited for it to clear, then switched on his flashlight and leaned inside. The beam cut through the dark, landing on rows of seats. Metal benches lined with decayed straps. The walls were streaked with black soot. For a second, everything seemed frozen in time, perfectly still. Then the light caught something pale against the floor. Bones. Marcus froze. The shape of a skull tilted toward him from the nearest seat, its jaw half missing, the rest fused to the rusted frame by time and decay. Behind it, another skeleton slumped sideways, wrists still shackled to the seat. A third leaned forward, face pressed against the bars of the divider. Their uniforms were mostly gone, tatters of gray and navy clinging to the bone, but faint patches of insignia still marked them as guards, not prisoners. His breath came slow and shallow. He stepped carefully inside, boots crunching over brittle fragments. The air was colder here, heavy with silence. The flashlight beam swept across the ceiling, catching cobwebs, then down the aisle, where empty restraints dangled from hooks. Near the back, the metal was scorched, warped as if from fire. The smell of rust mixed with something acrid. He crouched near the floor and saw the scattered gleam of brass. Bullet casings, dozens of them. He swallowed hard. This wasn't an accident. Someone had opened fire inside the truck. The pattern of the holes told the story. Shots fired from the front toward the rear. The guards never even drew their weapons. They were executed where they sat. The realization hit him like a blow. Whoever had done this hadn't just killed the transport team. They'd sealed them in, buried them, and erased them from memory. He moved toward the cab, shining the light through the narrow passage. The driver's seat was still occupied. The skeleton's hands rested on the wheel, head slumped forward, a small hole in the back of the skull. A revolver lay on the floor by the pedals, rusted solid. The front glass was spider-webbed with cracks through which dirt had slowly crept in over the years. He noticed something carved into the steel panel near the driver's side. He brushed the grime away and squinted. Words scratched by hand, shaky but legible. Not a breakout. A cleanup. He stood frozen, the words burning into him. A cleanup. The phrase echoed in his mind, twisting itself into something darker. This hadn't been a riot, not a crash or a freak storm. It was deliberate. Someone had turned this transport into a tomb. Marcus stepped back, trying to steady his breathing. His flashlight flickered once, then steadied again. He turned it toward the floor and noticed something small wedged between the metal plating near the driver's side, an object half buried in rust. He crouched, pried at it with his knife until it came loose. It was a badge, or what was left of one, burnt and bent. The emblem was faint, but he could make out part of the engraving. Corrections Officer Henry E. His fingers trembled. The rest of the name was gone, melted by time and fire, but it was enough. Henry Ellery, his father. The room seemed to tilt. He had to grab the seat to steady himself. His father had died when he was 9. Drowned, they'd said. Drowned on Lake Greeley, alone, after his shift. There had never been a funeral. No body, no closure. And now, after all these years, here it was. He sank to the floor, staring at the badge in his hand. The air pressed around him, thick with ghosts. It didn't make sense. None of it did. Why would his father's badge be here? Why had no one ever found this truck? Why had the official story been so clean, so final? He stayed there for a long time, barely breathing. The forest outside seemed to hum, the wind threading through the trees like whispers. Finally, he pocketed the badge and stood. His flashlight caught one last thing before he turned to leave, a deep gouge along the inside of the door, as if someone had tried to pry their way out from within. He climbed out into daylight, gasping as the fresh air hit his lungs. The sky was darker now, the sun swallowed by clouds. He could taste metal on his tongue. Every sound in the forest seemed sharper. The creak of branches, the distant rush of water, the faint hum of insects. But underneath it all, there was something else. Something that made his skin crawl. The feeling of being watched. Marcus stared at the half-open door, the black mouth of the truck gaping toward him. He felt like he'd crossed an invisible line, one that couldn't be uncrossed. He wanted to believe that unearthing it would bring peace, that he could just call the authorities, tell them what he found, and let it go. But deep down, he knew it wasn't going to be that simple. He gathered his tools, but before leaving, he picked up a long branch and wedged it into the ground near the truck's corner. A marker, something to guide him back. Then he stacked a small pile of stones beside it. The air was growing colder, the wind picking up. The forest seemed to shift as he climbed back toward his truck, the shadows lengthening even though the sun hadn't yet set. As he drove home, the world felt wrong. The familiar road looked different, darker somehow. He tried the radio again, hoping for noise, for distraction, but all he got was static. When he reached the cabin, he parked and sat there for a long time, staring out the windshield. The silence pressed in from all sides. Inside, he placed the badge on the kitchen table beside the flashlight and crowbar. The metal gleamed faintly under the weak bulb, still caked with rust and earth. He poured himself a glass of water, drank it in one long swallow, then poured another, lacing it with the smallest splash of whiskey. His hands were still shaking. That night, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those skeletons, bent, shackled, frozen in the final moment of violence. He saw the driver's skull, the bullet hole, the words carved into the wall. Not a breakout, a cleanup. He lay there, listening to the creak of the old floorboards, to the distant cry of night birds. Around midnight, the wind rose. It rattled the windows, made the pines groan. Marcus sat up and went to the window, half expecting to see headlights on the road or movement between the trees. There was nothing, just the dark shape of the forest stretching endlessly. He thought about calling the sheriff, about telling someone what he'd found, but the thought felt wrong. The badge in his pocket was proof of something bigger than a forgotten wreck. His father had been part of this, maybe even a victim of it. The official story had been a lie, and if it had stayed buried this long, it was because someone wanted it to stay that way. He sat at the table until dawn, staring at the badge. By the time the first light crept through the window, he'd made up his mind. Tomorrow he would go into town. He would find the records, the archives, the old news reports. He would learn what really happened in 1985 to his father and to the men who never made it home. Outside, the wind died down, leaving the forest in heavy silence. The world felt still again, as if it had paused to listen. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the first hint of daylight brushing across the worn floorboards. He didn't notice the shape of a single crow landing on the roof outside, nor the faint echo of something metallic creaking deep within the woods. He only knew that the silence beneath that steel wasn't just age or decay. It was something deliberate, something that had been buried alive. The morning came cold and colorless. The fog hadn't lifted, it had thickened, clinging to the ground in rolling swirls that hid the tree line and blurred the world into shades of gray. Marcus hadn't slept, not really. He dozed off sometime after dawn, but every time he closed his eyes, the image of the truck returned, the rusted steel, the bones, the words carved into the wall. When he finally sat up, his shirt clung to his back with sweat, and the smell of oil and damp wood filled the cabin. The badge still lay on the kitchen table, right where he had left it. Its edges caught the morning light, the engraved letters dulled by grime but unmistakable. Henry E. That one fragment of a name had split open everything he thought he knew about his father's death. He made coffee, strong and black, and stood by the window as it brewed. The forest outside was still, except for a single crow perched on the fence post. It watched him, head tilted as though it expected something. Marcus took a sip of the bitter coffee and tried to steady his thoughts. He told himself there had to be an explanation. Maybe his father had dropped his badge on a transport run before it disappeared. Maybe someone else had taken it. Maybe the truck had nothing to do with him. But every rational thought cracked under the weight of what he'd seen. His father had vanished in 1985. The truck had been buried around the same time. The badge wasn't a coincidence. By mid-morning, he'd decided to go into town. It wasn't much of a town anymore. 2 main streets, a gas station, a diner, a post office, and a small library that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1960s. He loaded the badge and a notebook into his jacket pocket, started the truck, and headed down the road. The drive felt longer than usual. The forest stretched endlessly on either side, the trees dense and tall, their branches clawing at the mist. He kept replaying old memories as he drove, his father's voice, deep and even, telling him to do the job right or don't do it at all. The way he'd come home from shifts smelling of metal and dust. The day he'd left for work and never returned. Marcus had been 9, standing on the porch, watching the truck disappear down the road. His mother had stood behind him, arms folded, lips pressed into a line. She'd never cried where he could see. She'd only said, "Your daddy loved you, that's all that matters." And then she'd locked that part of their life away forever. The library was quiet when he entered, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and mildew. A bell above the door jingled, and a thin, gray-haired woman behind the counter looked up with a polite smile. "Mornin'," she said softly. "Can I help you find something?" Marcus hesitated, unsure where to begin. "Old newspapers," he said finally. "Local archives, around 1985. Her eyes brightened. "We keep them in the back. Microfilm machine's a little slow, but it still works." She led him past rows of books to a small room where sunlight filtered through dusty blinds. The microfilm reader sat in the corner like an artifact from another time, its surface scratched and yellowed. "Anything in particular you're looking for?" she asked. He considered lying, then said, "A missing transport. Prison bus, Department of Corrections. Disappeared somewhere near here in the mid-'80s. Her brow furrowed. "Oh, I remember something like that," she said quietly. "Scared folks half to death back then. My brother worked at the mill and said they were stopping trucks on the highway for weeks. Never found anything, far as I know." She gave him a sympathetic look. "All the reels from that year are labeled by month. You'll want late summer, I think. That's when it happened." He nodded his thanks. When she left him alone, he sat at the machine, threading the film through with clumsy fingers. The machine hummed to life and the first image appeared on the screen. A front page from the Montgomery Ledger dated August 22, 1985. There it was. "Prison transport vanishes in storm. Authorities suspect escape." The article detailed how a Department of Corrections vehicle carrying 4 inmates and 2 guards had disappeared somewhere along Route 9 during a flash flood. The driver's last radio transmission had been garbled, ending abruptly with the words, "We're under," before cutting off. No bodies, no wreckage, no sign of survivors. After a 2-week search, the case had gone cold. The official statement claimed the vehicle had likely been washed into a ravine and buried by mudslides. Marcus scrolled slowly, absorbing every word. Then he saw the names of the guards. One of them was listed as Henry Ellery, 36 of Greeley County. His heart skipped. The second was James Red Kellerman, 40. The prisoners were listed too, all men in their 30s, all serving long sentences for various crimes. But at the end of the article, one detail caught his attention. All 4 inmates had been scheduled to testify in an upcoming federal case against Redgate Security Services, a private contractor accused of abusing prisoners during interstate transfers. Marcus leaned back in the chair, the name burning in his mind. Redgate. He'd seen that word before, on the old storage crates in his father's shed. He'd never thought much of it, assuming it was just one of the many suppliers his father dealt with during his job. But now the pieces started to shift. He spent the next few hours digging through more articles. Most repeated the same information. Tragic accident. Unrecovered wreck. No evidence of foul play. Yet every story seemed to end with an identical line. Investigation closed by Deputy Warden Harlan Green, citing lack of evidence and safety risk to search teams. Green, the same man who, according to later clippings, retired a year later and founded Redgate Construction and Security, LLC. By late afternoon, Marcus's eyes ached from staring at the screen. He copied notes, dates, and names into his notebook, drawing lines between them. His father, the missing truck, the company. It all circled back to Green. He returned the reels to the counter. The librarian glanced at the clock. "Find what you needed?" "Not yet," Marcus said, "but I'm getting close." She nodded, studying him for a moment. "That's how it starts, you know. People come in here looking for old ghosts. Sometimes they find them. Sometimes the ghosts find them first." He didn't answer. Outside, the light had already started to fade. The drive home was long, the sky turning the color of iron as the sun sank behind the hills. When he pulled up to the cabin, the forest was drenched in shadows. He unloaded the badge and his notebook, set them both on the table, and stared at them under the weak lamp glow. The air in the cabin felt colder, as if the walls had thinned. He poured himself another cup of coffee and sat down. His notes covered half the table now. Names, years, locations. Redgate Security had started as a small subcontractor, transporting inmates for the state. In the years following the disappearance of Unit 47, it had expanded rapidly, winning federal contracts worth millions. Within 5 years, Harlan Green owned 3 companies, 2 houses, and a lakefront property not far from where Marcus's father had supposedly drowned. He flipped through the pages of his notes until his eyes caught on something in one of the scanned reports. It was an old memo from the Department of Corrections archives, dated a week after the disappearance. The memo mentioned that the driver of the transport, Officer Henry Ellery, had been under internal review for potential whistleblower activity related to Redgate. Marcus sat frozen. His father hadn't drowned. He'd been silenced. The thought hit him so hard he had to set down the cup before it spilled. Everything made sense now. The missing truck, the official lies, the buried wreck. His father had tried to expose something, and they'd made sure he never could. They'd killed him, buried the evidence, and built an empire over his grave. He stood abruptly, pacing the room. The badge on the table gleamed dully. He picked it up and turned it over in his hand, feeling its weight, the way it pressed into his palm. He whispered the words aloud, as if to someone listening. "They buried you, but I found you." The night outside deepened, the woods swallowing what little light remained. Somewhere in the distance a branch cracked, sharp and loud. Marcus froze, listening. He waited for another sound, but none came. Just the whisper of wind through the trees. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was an animal, maybe a deer. Still, he checked the window before sitting back down. He spent the next hour mapping everything he had learned, circling names, drawing lines, connecting dates. When he finished, the picture was unmistakable. In 1985, Redgate orchestrated a false transport, loaded it with prisoners who were about to testify against them, and arranged for it to disappear. His father and another guard were collateral damage. Green had called off the search, declared them dead, and pocketed the insurance payouts and contract extensions that followed. The truck in the woods was the missing link, the one piece of truth that had clawed its way back through 38 years of dirt. And now Marcus had it. But knowledge brought danger too. He'd grown up around small-town men like Green, men who smiled in public and threatened in private, men whose power didn't come from law but from fear. If Redgate still operated, if Green was still alive, and the articles suggested he was, then Marcus knew he'd have to move carefully. He cleaned up the papers, stacking them neatly, and locked them in a metal toolbox he kept beneath the sink. Then he took the badge and hung it by a nail above his workbench. It didn't feel right to hide it again. His father had been silenced once. Marcus wouldn't let that happen a second time. The night stretched on. He sat outside on the porch, a cigarette burning between his fingers, though he hadn't smoked in years. The forest spread before him, vast and black, the smell of wet pine thick in the air. He thought of the truck sitting in that ravine, the door half open like a wound. He thought of the men trapped inside, waiting for help that never came. He wondered how long it had taken them to die, and whether any of them had realized what was really happening. He exhaled slowly, smoke curling upward into the dark. Somewhere, far off, thunder rumbled. Before going inside, he looked once more toward the ridge where the trees swayed faintly against the horizon. He couldn't see it, but he knew the truck was still there, buried beneath years of silence. It wasn't done with him yet. He could feel it in his bones. The story wasn't finished. Tomorrow he would go deeper. He would find out who Harlan Green really was, what Redgate had become, and how far their roots still reached. And when he had the truth, he would decide what to do with it. He turned off the porch light, closed the door, and locked it behind him. The cabin sank into darkness, but his mind stayed lit with questions. Outside, the forest whispered as if the ghosts of 1985 were stirring, finally ready to be heard. By the time the sun climbed over the pines, the fog had thinned into low strips that floated above the ground like remnants of breath. Marcus hadn't slept more than an hour, but he didn't need sleep. His mind was locked on one thought that repeated like the steady rhythm of an engine. Redgate. Every path led there. Every lie, every missing name, every silence. The company that had once been a minor security contractor now stood at the center of a decades-old cover-up, and the man who'd built it, Harlan Green, was still alive, still living in the same county where the truck had disappeared. Marcus had written the name in his notebook a dozen times through the night, underlined it, circled it, stared at it until the letters blurred. The morning was clear and bright when he stepped out of the cabin. The forest looked almost peaceful in the daylight, the way a wild animal looks docile while it's waiting to strike. He packed his bag carefully. Gloves, crowbar, flashlight, camera, and the notebook filled with his father's name. Before leaving, his eyes flicked once to the badge hanging on the wall above his workbench. The metal glinted in the light. "I'll find it," he muttered under his breath. "Whatever they buried, I'll find all of it." The drive to the next town took nearly 2 hours along winding back roads that cut through hills and hollowed valleys. The signs grew older the farther he went, hand-painted boards with half-peeled lettering and rusted nails. The GPS on his phone had long since stopped working. He followed instinct and memory instead. Somewhere ahead lay the remains of what used to be Redgate's operations yard, a place his father had mentioned once when Marcus was a boy. He remembered the story now, told over a dinner table in a voice both proud and uneasy. "They call it Red Gate because of the dirt," his father had said, smiling faintly. "All clay out there. Looks like blood when it rains." Marcus hadn't understood then. Now the memory carried a weight that twisted inside him. He reached the site near noon. The road narrowed to a rutted track, overgrown with weeds and flanked by sagging fences. A hand-painted sign still hung by one hinge, reading Red Gate Security and Transport. Authorized personnel only. The gate itself was missing, replaced by a gap between leaning posts. Beyond it stretched a wide, empty yard strewn with debris. Old tires, rusted machinery, collapsed storage sheds. A few crows flitted between the beams of the broken warehouse that loomed at the far end. The air was still, thick with the smell of dust and decay. Marcus parked the truck just inside the fence and stepped out, the crunch of gravel loud in the quiet. The warehouse doors were half open, one hanging crooked from a chain. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed them wider. Inside, the light filtered through holes in the roof, slicing the darkness into stripes. Dust swirled like smoke. Rows of wooden crates stood stacked along the walls, some stamped with the old Red Gate insignia, an eagle clutching a set of keys. Most had collapsed under their own weight. He moved slowly through the space, scanning for anything that might tell him what this place had been used for. In one corner, he found a desk buried under papers, the wood warped and soft from years of moisture. Folders lay scattered across it, their labels faded, but a few were still legible. Transportation logs, 1984-85. His pulse quickened. He pulled one open, careful not to tear the pages. Most were routine. Lists of routes, prisoner names, times of departure and arrival. But at the bottom of the stack, one report stood out. The handwriting was different, slanted and hurried. Transfer 47, delayed due to personnel discrepancy. Authorized by H. Green. No further action required. He stared at the words until they blurred. Transfer 47. His father's route, the last journey before the truck vanished. The page was dated 2 days before the official disappearance. Something creaked above him. Marcus froze, listening. A pigeon fluttered out through a hole in the roof, its wings stirring dust. He exhaled, realizing his hands were shaking. He slipped the paper into his bag and moved deeper into the warehouse. Near the back wall, he found a rusted metal door sealed with a chain. The chain was old, the lock eaten with corrosion. He pried it open with the crowbar, metal shrieking in protest, and stepped inside. The small room beyond smelled of mold and old oil. Shelves lined the walls, holding boxes of tapes, reels, and records labeled Archive, Do Not Remove. He flicked on his flashlight. The beam caught a film canister marked Oct 1985. Internal interview files. His breath hitched. He grabbed one of the reels and turned it over. It was brittle but intact. The edge of a label peeked through dust. D. Green, Witness Prep, Ellery present. He didn't have to think twice. He packed the reel into his bag along with a few others, then turned to leave. But before he reached the door, the beam of his flashlight passed over something carved into the wooden frame. At first, he thought it was graffiti, but as he looked closer, he recognized the careful, deliberate etching of a hand that had known it wouldn't be seen again. They won't let us out. The words chilled him. He ran his fingers across the grooves, the splinters catching at his skin. He could almost see his father's face there, pressing a knife to the wood, leaving behind the only truth he could. When Marcus stepped back into the daylight, his shirt was damp with sweat. He locked the warehouse behind him, though the gesture felt hollow. There was nothing left here to protect except ghosts. As he crossed the yard, a low rumble of thunder rolled through the sky. The smell of rain rose again from the earth, metallic and red. He drove away as the first drops began to fall, mud splattering the windshield like rust. Back at the cabin, the storm broke in earnest. Rain hammered the roof, turning the dirt road into a river of clay. Marcus spread the files across the kitchen table, sorting through them by lantern light. Most of the papers were too damaged to read, but a few names repeated across multiple documents: Green, Kellerman, and a deputy named Carson Hale. Hale had signed off on dozens of reports, each time marking them verified transport complete. The same phrase appeared on Transfer 47's final entry, even though the truck never reached its destination. The film reels sat beside the papers, water dripping from their edges. He wiped one clean and held it up to the light. The faint images on the strip showed a room, a table, and men in uniforms, grainy silhouettes frozen in time. He didn't have the equipment to play them here. He'd need to borrow an old projector, maybe from the high school or a pawn shop. But the labels alone told him enough to know he was holding something dangerous. He spent the evening piecing together a timeline, tracing the rise of Redgate from a small contractor to a multi-million-dollar company. Green had filed the articles of incorporation less than 6 months after the disappearance of the transport. Within 2 years, he'd purchased 3 quarries, 2 of which had been active sites for state construction projects. The third was decommissioned and fenced off, a perfect place to bury something that shouldn't exist. Marcus marked the location on a map. The quarry lay just 15 miles from the site of the truck. He remembered his father's stories about working late shifts out there, long nights guarding convoys that came and went without record. Some shipments, his father had said once, don't exist on paper, but they still move. The storm outside deepened into a roar. Lightning flashed through the windows, illuminating the room in brief electric bursts. In one flash, Marcus thought he saw movement by the tree line. A shape, maybe human, maybe not. He killed the lantern and stood in the dark, listening. The rain muted everything but the steady drum of water on the roof. Nothing moved. Yet the unease didn't fade. He waited until the storm quieted before relighting the lantern. He returned to the table and stared at the map again. The pattern was too clean to be coincidence. Green had used Redgate as more than a security firm. It had been a machine for laundering blood money, building its fortune on the silence of the dead. The prisoners in that truck hadn't been random convicts. They'd been witnesses, men who knew too much. His father had tried to stop it, and for that he'd been erased. The sound of his own breath filled the cabin. For the first time since finding the truck, Marcus felt not just grief, but anger, deep and electric, the kind that burned through fear. He stood and paced the room, gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles whitened. They'd buried the truth under dirt and time, but he'd already started to dig, and he wasn't about to stop. He needed proof, something solid enough to destroy Green's story once and for all. The tapes were a start, but he needed corroboration, witnesses, records. He decided to visit the town of Harmony Hollow, where Green's new company, Redgate Construction and Gravel, still operated. Maybe he could find someone who remembered the old days, someone who had seen too much and stayed silent too long. The next morning came washed clean by rain. The air smelled sharp, the kind of freshness that follows a storm but doesn't erase what came before. Marcus loaded his bag with the papers and reels, wrapped them in plastic, and placed them behind the seat of his truck. He felt exposed now, as if invisible eyes followed every move. When he reached the highway, he spotted a black SUV in his rearview mirror, a new model, tinted windows. It stayed behind him for nearly 10 miles before turning off suddenly onto a dirt road. He told himself it was coincidence, but his pulse wouldn't slow. Harmony Hollow sat in a shallow valley surrounded by low ridges and red clay fields. The town center was small but neat, anchored by a courthouse and a diner with a sign that read The Hollow Grill. Marcus parked outside, ordered coffee, and sat near the window where he could see the street. The waitress was friendly, chatty in the way small-town servers often were. When he asked about Harlan Green, her smile faltered slightly. "Mr. Green," she said, lowering her voice. "He's got that big estate out on Miller's Bend. Don't see him in town much, runs his business from home these days. Still owns Redgate Construction?" She nodded, glancing around before leaning closer. "He owns half the county, if we're being honest. Got friends everywhere, judges, sheriffs, you name it. Folks around here don't cross him. Not if they like their roofs over their heads." Marcus thanked her, left a tip, and returned to the truck. He sat behind the wheel, watching the courthouse clock tick past noon. The rain had stopped, but the sky stayed heavy and low. He knew what he had to do next. Green's estate wasn't far. He could at least see it, get a sense of the man who'd built his fortune on other people's graves. The road to Miller's Bend wound through farmland before narrowing into a lane shaded by oaks. When the estate came into view, Marcus felt the air tighten in his chest. The house was enormous. White pillars, wide porch, manicured lawn, but what struck him most was the fence. High, black iron, topped with cameras. The kind of security you didn't need unless you had something to hide. He parked at a distance behind a line of trees and raised his binoculars. A man stood on the porch, silver-haired, tall, wearing a crisp shirt and slacks. Even from afar, Marcus recognized him from the photographs he'd seen in old news clippings. Harlan Green looked every bit the successful businessman, calm, dignified, untouchable. But when Green turned slightly toward the driveway, sunlight caught his eyes, and Marcus saw something else there. Cold calculation, a predator's patience. He lowered the binoculars, heart hammering. The urge to confront him surged and broke like a wave. "Not yet," he told himself. "Not until I can prove it." He drove back to the cabin as dusk settled, the red clay of the road glowing in the last light. His mind buzzed with what he'd seen. The documents, the tapes, Green's estate rising like a monument to guilt. The pieces fit too neatly to ignore. The storm was coming, not of rain this time, but a reckoning. When he reached home, the forest greeted him with its old quiet. He brought the tapes inside, locked the door, and sat beside the stove until the fire burned low. Tomorrow he would find a way to play the reels, to see the faces of the men who'd died for silence. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of clay and rain. It brushed against the cabin walls like a whisper, as if the forest itself remembered the blood in its soil. And for the first time, Marcus felt certain that the truth, no matter how deep it had been buried, was finally beginning to rise. The rain returned before dawn, slow and steady, drumming against the tin roof until it sounded like a heartbeat. Marcus woke in the dark, his mind already moving before his body did. Sleep had become impossible these past few days. Every time his eyes closed, he saw his father's badge gleaming in the beam of his flashlight, saw the skeletons in the armored truck, the etched words in steel whispering back from another century. The storm outside felt almost merciful. It was Noyes. Steady, simple, honest. Noyes meant he wasn't alone with his thoughts. He sat at the table where the files and maps still lay scattered from the night before. The air smelled faintly of damp paper and burnt coffee. The reels he'd found at Redgate sat beside them, wrapped in oilcloth. He'd spent half the previous evening trying to find someone who could play them. Old hardware was rare, but there was a shop in a nearby town, a place that bought and sold everything from scrap televisions to VHS players. If he could get those tapes converted to digital files, he might have something no one could erase again. He stood, poured himself coffee, and stepped onto the porch. The world beyond the trees was gray and soft, a place made of rain and mud. He'd always thought of the land here as red because of the iron in the soil, but this morning it was deeper than that, like the earth itself had been stained by something that wouldn't wash away. He took a long breath and let it out slow. Somewhere beyond those trees, Harlan Green was eating breakfast in his mansion, safe and clean, believing his sins had been buried forever. Marcus smiled without humor. He was going to change that. The drive to town was slow. The dirt road had turned into a slick river of clay, and the truck's tires fought for traction. The rain thickened, pounding hard enough that the wipers struggled to keep up. Every few miles he thought he saw headlights behind him, only for them to vanish into the mist. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe it was exactly what it felt like, the shadow of Green's reach stretching farther than he'd realized. He reached the pawn shop by mid-morning. The place was a sagging building on the edge of a strip mall, its windows cluttered with old electronics, dusty guitars, and rusted tools. Inside, the air smelled of dust and solder. Behind the counter stood a man in his 50s with a heavy mustache and kind eyes. His name tag read Clint. Marcus explained what he had, old film reels from the 80s, possibly government property, and asked if Clint had the means to play or transfer them. The man scratched his chin, thoughtful. I got a 16mm projector in the back. Doesn't run smooth, but it'll show something. You want digital copies, I can do that too. Gonna take a few hours, though. Marcus handed over the reels, trying not to show his tension. Handle them carefully, he said. They're evidence. Clint's eyebrows lifted. Evidence, huh? You a cop? Not exactly, Marcus replied. Just someone looking for the truth. He left the reels and stepped outside to wait, pacing the sidewalk as the rain eased to a drizzle. Across the street, an old diner flickered with neon. He went in, ordered eggs and toast, and sat near the window where he could watch the shop. The coffee was weak but warm, the food tasteless but grounding. He kept glancing at the door, expecting someone to walk in and call his name. Nobody did. The minutes stretched into hours. By the time Clint called, the sky had cleared into a washed-out blue. Marcus hurried back across the street. The man handed him a flash drive and one of the original reels. Got 4 good clips, Clint said. Most of it's interviews, grainy as hell, but the audio came through better than I expected. Some of the tapes burned or warped. Whatever's on there, it's old. Marcus paid in cash and thanked him. Back in his truck, he plugged the drive into his laptop. The screen flickered, then filled with the gray grain of static. Slowly, an image resolved. A small interrogation room with concrete walls and a flickering fluorescent light. 2 men sat across from each other. One wore a correctional officer's uniform. The other's face was blurred by damage in the film, but his voice was clear, a deep southern drawl laced with anger. "You think you can hide this?" the man said. "You think nobody's gonna talk?" The officer leaned forward. You'll testify when you're told, and you'll say what we told you to say. That's how you get your deal." The prisoner laughed, bitter and sharp. "Ain't no deal. You ain't gonna let us make it to that courthouse." Then came a voice off camera, calm, commanding. "That's enough, Henry." Marcus froze. He knew that voice. He'd heard it in old cassette recordings of his father reading bedtime stories. He leaned closer to the screen as the camera shifted, revealing his father's face. Young, serious, the lines of a man trying to do right in a place built on wrong. "These men are witnesses," Henry Ellery said. "They deserve protection." The unseen voice replied, "They're liabilities." The footage crackled, jumped, and then the sound of gunfire cut through the static before the reel ended abruptly. Marcus sat back, heart pounding. He replayed the clip 3 times, hoping the final frame would show who the voice belonged to, but the angle never changed. Still, he knew. Harland Green. His father had stood up to him, and Green had silenced him for it. He copied the files onto multiple drives and hid one in the glove compartment, another beneath the truck seat. Then he drove home, the weight of what he'd seen pressing against his chest. The truth was no longer speculation, it was living proof. But with proof came danger. That night, he sat at the table surrounded by maps and notes, tracing lines from one name to another. Every thread led back to Green. But now he understood something new. Redgate had never been just a transport company. It had been a private arm of the state, a way to move people who knew too much, to make them vanish quietly. Green hadn't just killed his father and those prisoners. He'd built an empire on that silence. The phone rang just after midnight. Marcus hesitated before answering. The voice on the other end was low and male. "Mr. Ellery? Who's asking?" "This is Detective Cole from the Montgomery Sheriff's Department. We received a report you've been asking about a certain disappearance. Thought you should know the files on that case are sealed. For your own good, stop digging." The line went dead. Marcus stared at the receiver, anger boiling through the fear. Green's reach was deeper than he'd thought. Law enforcement, the courts, maybe even state officials. He couldn't rely on the police. They were part of it. He spent the next day preparing. He scanned every document, uploaded copies to cloud servers under false names, and wrote a detailed statement outlining everything he'd found. Then he contacted a journalist he'd read about years ago, Leah Ford, the one who'd exposed corruption in Arkansas. He sent her a message through a secure email channel, attaching a few files as proof. He didn't include his name yet, only his initials and a note. The truck was found. The bodies are real. Redgate buried them. Green signed the orders. Hours passed before she replied. The message was short but clear. "I believe you. Send everything." Marcus hesitated, then attached the rest of the files, including the video clips. He stared at the screen for a long time before hitting send. When the message finally left his outbox, he felt both lighter and terrified. There was no taking it back. That evening, the air outside felt electric. The sky was an iron gray that promised more storms. He stood on the porch, watching the horizon darken. Somewhere deep in the woods, thunder rolled and the wind bent the trees. The smell of rain and pine filled the air. By the next morning, the story had begun to move. Leah Ford had responded again, saying she was verifying the evidence and contacting federal sources. She promised protection, though Marcus doubted anyone could truly guarantee it. Still, he felt something shift inside him, a sense of control he hadn't felt since this started. The silence was breaking. He spent the day watching the news, waiting for any sign that the story had gone public. None came. Instead, around sunset, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. A black SUV parked across the road, half hidden behind the trees. It didn't move for hours. When darkness fell, he turned off all the lights inside the cabin and sat by the window, watching. The SUV stayed where it was, its headlights off, its windows dark. Around midnight, a flash of lightning illuminated the outline of a man standing beside it. By the time Marcus blinked, the figure was gone. At dawn, the vehicle had disappeared, but the warning was clear. Green knew. He packed a duffel with essentials, clothes, food, the hard drives, and loaded them into his truck. He didn't plan to run, not exactly, but he needed to be ready. Before leaving the cabin, he looked once more at the badge on the wall. "I'm not done," he whispered. The road was slick again from the night's rain. He drove into town, where the local paper's headline nearly stopped his heart. Federal investigation into Redgate, Inc. Sources claim cover-up of 1985 transport murders. Leah had done it. The story was out. He bought a copy and read it at a diner booth, hands trembling slightly. The article named Harland Green as a suspect in multiple counts of obstruction and homicide. It quoted anonymous sources within law enforcement and mentioned evidence recently submitted to the Department of Justice. There was even a photograph, a grainy image of the armored truck half buried in mud, the door hanging open like a wound. But victory came with consequence. Beneath the article, another headline made his blood run cold. Unidentified fire destroys rural property near Greeley Ridge. He didn't need to read further. His cabin. By the time he drove back, smoke still hung over the trees. The house was gone, reduced to blackened timbers. The air reeked of ash and gasoline. He knew it hadn't been an accident. Whoever had done this had waited until he left. A warning or punishment. He stood in the ruins for a long time, rain dripping from his jacket. Everything he'd owned, tools, photos, his father's letters, was gone. All except for what he carried. The evidence, the truth. He left the ashes behind and drove without direction until the sky began to lighten. When he finally stopped, he was miles from anywhere, parked beside an empty stretch of road. He leaned back against the seat, exhausted. The anger that had carried him this far flickered, replaced by something quieter. Resolve. He pulled out his phone and opened Leah's latest message. "They're scared," she'd written. "That means we're close." Marcus smiled faintly. The truth was out there now, spreading faster than Green could contain it. Redgate's empire was cracking, its foundation built on blood and lies. For the first time, Marcus felt like his father wasn't buried in silence anymore. He turned off the engine, closed his eyes, and let the rain tap softly against the windshield. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again. Not a threat this time, but a promise. The storm was here, and it was his. The fire had devoured everything. What hadn't burned had melted, warped into blackened shapes that barely resembled the things they'd once been. The air was thick with the scent of wet ash and oil. Marcus stood at the edge of what used to be his cabin, staring at the ruin in silence. Rain still fell lightly, hissing as it met the smoldering wood. The badge that had hung on the wall was gone, the floor reduced to charcoal and twisted nails. His father's memory, every photograph, every letter, had been turned to smoke and scattered into the gray morning sky. The flames had eaten his past, but not his purpose. If Green had meant to frighten him into retreat, he had miscalculated. Fear had long ago stopped being an unfamiliar companion to Marcus. It had settled into his bones during the years of quiet loneliness, of nights where the only sound was the whisper of trees against the roof. But now, standing amid the ruins, that fear hardened into something else. Resolve. He sifted through the ashes for hours, his gloves blackened, his eyes burning from the acrid smoke. He found the twisted remains of his workbench, the melted edge of his father's wrench, and near what had once been the doorway, the charred handle of a shovel. Everything was gone except the earth itself, and even that looked scorched. By noon, the rain had washed the last traces of smoke into the ground, leaving behind only the quiet hum of dripping leaves and the low growl of thunder far away. He knelt once more and picked up a lump of blackened metal, still warm. It was part of the latch from the badge frame. He turned it over in his hand until the soot rubbed off on his skin. Then he let it fall. Some things couldn't be salvaged. He climbed into his truck and drove. The road wound through the forest like a scar, slick and red with mud. The windshield wipers beat a slow rhythm against the glass. The radio stayed silent. He hadn't turned it on since the night he'd found the truck. Outside, the forest blurred past in streaks of green and gray. He didn't know exactly where he was going, only that he couldn't stay. Leah had promised protection, but he knew better than to trust promises that came from a distance. Green's people were close. The fire had proved that. By late afternoon, he reached a small town on the state line, little more than a cluster of gas stations and motels strung along the highway. He paid cash for a room under a false name and parked the truck out of sight behind the building. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and bleach. The carpet was worn thin, the walls stained by decades of smoke. He didn't mind. It had a door that locked and a window that opened onto an alley, both things that mattered more now than comfort. He set up his laptop on the nightstand and connected the portable drive. The files opened in neat folders, each named for the date and location. He played one of the clips again, his father's voice filling the dim room. These men are witnesses. They deserve protection. Every time he heard those words, his chest tightened. They were more than evidence. They were the sound of a man who'd refused to bend. He uploaded the files to a second cloud server, then encrypted another copy for Leah. Within minutes, her reply came through. "They hit your cabin, didn't they?" He typed back, "Yes, you need to leave the area. They won't stop. The feds are moving in. Green's assets are frozen, but he's not in custody yet." "Where is he?" "Still at his estate. Surveillance teams are on him, but it's delicate. There's talk he might try to flee before charges are filed. He's not the kind of man who goes quietly." Marcus leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. The old plaster was cracked, water-stained. Somewhere in the next room, a television played faintly, a news anchor's voice rising and falling. He caught fragments of words: Redgate scandal, corruption, federal investigation. The truth was no longer buried. It was out there, alive, spreading across the country. And yet, Green still walked free. The man who'd murdered his father, who'd built his fortune from the bones of the forgotten, was still sleeping in a mansion surrounded by iron gates. Marcus felt something shift inside him, something sharp and heavy. He opened the drawer of the nightstand and pulled out his father's old revolver, the one he'd kept oiled and clean even when he'd promised never to use it again. He checked the chamber, 6 rounds loaded, then set it on the table beside the laptop. The rain outside had stopped, but thunder still rolled somewhere distant. He didn't need Leah to tell him what to do next. He already knew. He drove again that night, the highway stretching ahead like a river of silver under the streetlights. The world beyond the windshield was quiet, almost too quiet. When he reached the turnoff for Miller's Bend, he slowed, headlights dimmed. The lane that led to Green's estate was empty. The gate still standing tall, the cameras faintly glowing in the dark. He parked the truck half a mile away and walked the rest of the distance on foot. The air smelled of wet clay and pine sap. Crickets chirped in the grass, oblivious to the storm of human reckoning that was about to unfold. The estate rose before him, pale against the black sky. The windows glowed faintly with warm light. Somewhere inside, Green was awake. Marcus could see the shadow of movement across the curtains. He crouched near the fence, studying the layout. The cameras swept in slow, predictable arcs. He waited for their rhythm, then climbed the fence when their gaze turned away. The metal was slick but quiet. On the other side, the ground was soft, the manicured lawn a stark contrast to the wild earth he'd come from. He moved quickly, hugging the shadows. When he reached the porch, he paused, listening. The hum of the house filled the air. Refrigerators, lights, the distant murmur of a television. He stepped onto the wooden boards and tried the door. Locked. But through the glass he could see a sliver of the interior. Polished floors, framed photographs, the kind of wealth that came from other people's suffering. He broke in through a side window. The glass cracked softly, the sound lost in the wind. Inside, the air was cool, perfumed faintly with leather and old wood. The room he entered was a study. Bookshelves lined the walls, their titles gleaming in the lamplight. A half-empty glass of whiskey sat on the desk beside an open ledger. Marcus recognized the handwriting immediately. It matched the reports from the Redgate warehouse. He flipped through the pages, scanning for numbers, names, anything concrete. There it was again. Transfer 47. A ledger entry dated the same week as the disappearance, followed by a payment listed under a false company name. He snapped photographs of each page with his phone, then pocketed the ledger. Somewhere deeper in the house, a floorboard creaked. He froze. The sound came again, deliberate this time. Someone was awake. He moved silently toward the hallway, every step calculated. As he rounded the corner, he saw Green. The old man stood at the far end of the hall, a robe wrapped around his thin frame, a pistol in one hand. His hair was silver, his face pale but steady. He didn't look surprised. "You shouldn't be here," Green said, his voice calm, almost weary. "But I suppose you would come eventually." Marcus didn't answer. The revolver hung loosely at his side. Green took a slow step forward. "I remember your father. Good man. Too good. The kind who thought truth mattered more than survival." He smiled faintly. "He didn't understand how the world works. I tried to teach him." "You murdered him," Marcus said, his voice low, shaking despite his effort to hold it steady. "You buried him like trash." "I cleaned up a mistake," Green replied. "That transport was never meant to exist. Those men, your father included, knew things that would have destroyed people far above me. You think this was my doing alone? You think I'm the monster?" Marcus raised the revolver, finger tightening on the trigger. Green didn't flinch. "Go on," he said softly. "Pull it. It won't change what's already in motion. The truth's a funny thing, son. You think it sets you free, but all it really does is ruin what's left." For a moment, the only sound was the storm wind pressing against the walls. Marcus's hand trembled. He had imagined this moment 100 times, standing over the man who had destroyed his family, seeing the fear in his eyes. But there was no fear in Green, only cold certainty. Before Marcus could decide, headlights cut across the front of the house. A car door slammed, voices shouted. Green's eyes widened for the first time. "They're here," he said. "You brought them." Marcus turned toward the window. Flashlights flickered in the rain. Federal agents moved across the lawn in formation, their jackets marked with bold yellow letters. Someone had tipped them off. Maybe Leah. Maybe the local sheriff who'd finally decided to act. Green dropped the pistol and raised his hands. "Looks like you got what you wanted after all," he said, his voice almost amused. Marcus lowered the revolver. "No," he said quietly. "This isn't for me. It's for him." The agents burst through the door seconds later, shouting commands. Green was handcuffed and led away, still smirking faintly, as if the world couldn't truly touch him. Marcus stood in the corner, the revolver hanging at his side, the weight of years pressing down on him. One of the agents approached, a tall man with a weathered face and steady eyes. "Marcus Allori?" he asked. Marcus nodded. "We've got enough to bring him down. Your files, the recordings, the ledger, it's all here. You did good." Marcus didn't feel good. He felt hollow, like the wind had blown straight through him. He followed the agents outside. The rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and clean. The first light of dawn broke through the clouds, painting the wet grass in pale gold. Green was loaded into a black SUV, his face turned toward the horizon. For the first time, he looked old, small, human. Marcus stood there until the vehicles disappeared down the road. Then he turned back toward the house, its front door hanging open, the smell of whiskey and dust still drifting from inside. The silence that followed felt different this time. Not empty, but waiting. He walked down the drive until the estate was just a silhouette against the morning sky. The world around him was quiet, except for the distant cry of a hawk overhead. For the first time in almost 40 years, the truth was free. His father's name would no longer be whispered or forgotten. The men who died in that truck would finally be given their rest. Yet, as he stood there, the weight of everything settled over him. The cost of truth wasn't measured in victory, but in loss. He'd lost his home, his peace, his anonymity. He'd traded silence for clarity and found that clarity could cut sharper than any blade. He drove until the highway opened before him, endless and bright beneath the rising sun. The road stretched toward towns he didn't know, toward a life he hadn't planned. He didn't know where he'd go next, only that he couldn't return to the ashes he'd left behind. But as the wind rolled through the open window and the scent of rain faded into pine, Marcus felt something he hadn't in years, something like release. The silence would always be there, waiting in the spaces between memory and truth. But now, at least, it no longer belonged to Green. It belonged to him. The trial began 6 months later, but the echoes of everything that came before never really faded. Time, it turned out, didn't heal. It only rearranged what was left. The story of Redgate had swept through the country like wildfire. News anchors dissected it in the evenings. Documentary crews arrived to film the ruins of Green's estate, and the families of the dead guards and prisoners finally had names to bury, graves to visit, and someone to blame. For the first time in decades, the truth was visible, raw and bright under the harsh light of day, yet for Marcus, the silence afterward felt heavier than before. He'd spent those months in a small rented house on the outskirts of Knoxville, a quiet place with creaking floors and a view of the river. The FBI had insisted on protection at first, but he'd refused it after the second week. He didn't want agents sitting outside his door like ghosts in black jackets. He'd already lived too long under the watch of unseen eyes. He wanted to feel the world again, to know what it meant to walk into town, to buy groceries, to drink coffee without checking for shadows. The neighbors kept to themselves, and that suited him fine. Every morning he drove into the city for the hearings. Green appeared each day in a tailored gray suit, hair neatly combed, skin pale under the courthouse lights. The years of arrogance had melted into something else. Cold calculation masked his frailty. He said little, spoke only through lawyers, and carried himself with the serenity of a man who still believed money could erase the stains of blood. But Marcus knew better. He watched from the gallery, silent, his hands folded. He wasn't there for vengeance anymore. He was there to finish what his father had started. The prosecution laid out the evidence piece by piece. The documents from Redgate's files, the recovered tapes, the testimonies of former employees who had lived long enough to remember what they'd seen but had been too afraid to speak. Each day chipped away at Green's empire until only the bones of it remained. The story the court heard was uglier than Marcus had imagined. Redgate had been a machine for laundering government money through false contracts, using inmate transfers as cover for illegal shipments, arms, stolen property, even human trafficking in the early years. The truck in the hills hadn't just carried witnesses. It had carried the evidence of corruption that reached far beyond one man. When the prosecutor played the recording, the reel where Henry Ellery's voice demanded protection for the prisoners, the courtroom went still. Marcus sat with his eyes closed, listening as his father's words filled the space, trembling slightly from the age of the tape. He could almost see him there again, alive, strong, refusing to look away from the truth. For the first time in nearly 40 years, his father's voice was no longer trapped in the dark. Green didn't react to the audio, not at first, but when the prosecutor displayed the photographs, the ones from inside the truck, the bones, the carved words on the metal, something flickered in his expression. It wasn't guilt. It was recognition, the moment a man realizes his story is no longer under his control. The trial stretched for weeks. Reporters called Marcus the whistleblower's son, though he never spoke to them. Leah Ford attended most days, sitting near the back, taking notes in her weathered leather journal. Her articles had turned the case from rumor into fact, and now she was writing the end of it. She and Marcus rarely talked inside the courthouse, but afterward they would sometimes share coffee in a diner nearby, the kind with chipped cups and old photographs on the wall. She asked once if he felt vindicated. He shook his head. "You can't win against death," he said. "You just make sure it means something." She didn't argue. When the verdict came, it was almost anticlimactic. Guilty on all counts: murder, conspiracy, obstruction, fraud, life without parole. Green stood still as the judge spoke, his hands clasped before him, eyes fixed on the table. When the sentence was read, he looked up for the first time and found Marcus in the crowd. For a moment, their eyes met across the room. There was no triumph in Marcus's face, no anger left to give. There was only exhaustion. Green blinked once, like a man accepting something inevitable, then turned away as the guards let him out. The courthouse emptied slowly after that. People lingered in the corridors, talking in low voices, shaking hands, some crying quietly. Marcus walked out into the sunlight, the air bright and clean after a night of rain. The steps were crowded with reporters, cameras flashing, microphones reaching like spears. He didn't stop for any of them. He kept walking until the noise faded behind him and the city's hum took over. He drove for hours that day, aimless, the road unspooling ahead of him like a thread. When he finally stopped, it was near the ridge where it had all begun, the smoky foothills where the trees grew close and the wind carried whispers through the pines. The trail was overgrown now, reclaimed by moss and time, but he found his way easily. The markers he'd left, the stack of stones, the scarred trunk, were still there, softened by weather but standing. The gully looked different in daylight, smaller somehow, as if the forest itself had decided to shrink away from what had once been buried there. The armored truck still sat half sunken into the earth, its steel skeleton streaked with rust. Nature had begun to claim it again. Vines curled through the broken windows, grass grew between the seams, yet it didn't feel dead. It felt like a monument, ugly, enduring, honest. Marcus stood there for a long time, the wind cool against his face. He imagined his father standing in that same place decades ago, staring at the road before it all went wrong. He thought of the men in that truck, their last moments sealed in darkness, and of all the years that followed, when the world moved on without them. Then he thought of how the truth had clawed its way back, stubborn and unyielding. Some stories refused to stay buried. He walked closer, kneeling beside the open hatch. Inside, the smell of rust and damp earth filled the air. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a replacement badge he'd had made in his father's name, engraved with the same number from the original. He placed it gently on the floor of the truck where the bones had once been, and whispered, "You're home now." The forest was silent. Then, somewhere high above, a hawk cried out, sharp and distant. The sound echoed down through the trees, fading into the hollow where the truck lay. Marcus stood, brushing the dirt from his hands, and felt something loosen in his chest. Not peace exactly, but something close to it. On his way back down the trail, he passed a man walking up, a ranger, judging by the uniform and the tools slung over his shoulder. The man nodded politely. "You're the one who found it, aren't you?" he asked. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "Good thing you did," the ranger said. "They're turning this area into a memorial. State's already approved it. Thought you should know." Marcus smiled faintly. "I'm glad." He walked on, the forest thinning as he neared the road. The ranger's words followed him, soft but grounding. A memorial. It was more than he'd ever hoped for. The dead would no longer lie nameless in the dark. By the time he reached his truck, the sky had begun to clear. Sunlight broke through the clouds, warm against his skin. He sat behind the wheel for a long time before starting the engine, watching the light move across the hills. The forest, once a place of secrets, now looked different. Alive, forgiven. That evening, he returned to Knoxville to find a letter waiting for him at the door. It was from Leah. Inside was a photograph, him standing on the courthouse steps, head turned slightly away from the cameras, and beneath it, a handwritten note. "Truth doesn't end things, Marcus. It begins them." He set the photo on the table and poured himself a glass of whiskey. Outside, the city lights flickered against the river. He thought about what Leah had written, and realized she was right. Truth wasn't the end of silence. It was the start of something new. In the weeks that followed, he started fixing engines again. Word spread quietly, and soon people from the nearby towns began bringing their trucks and tractors to his shop. He never advertised. He didn't need to. They came because they trusted him, because they'd seen his name in the papers and wanted to shake his hand, to tell him thank you. He listened to their stories, their small-town struggles, and for the first time in a long time, he felt connected to the world around him again. Sometimes, late at night, he would drive back toward the hills, park by the overlook and watch the mist roll through the valleys. He no longer feared the silence. It had become a companion, steady, honest, a reminder of what was lost and what was gained. The world had moved on from Redgate, but traces of it lingered in every headline, every whispered conversation about corruption and courage. People called him a hero, though he never believed it. Heroes were men who acted without cost. He had paid dearly. Yet he knew his father would have been proud, and that was enough. On the anniversary of the trial's end, he visited the memorial for the first time. It stood in a clearing just above the ridge where sunlight broke through the trees even in winter. 2 bronze plaques bore the names of the guards and prisoners, each letter carved clean and deep. Beneath them, a simple inscription read, "For those silenced by greed, remembered by truth." Flowers lay at the base, left by strangers. Marcus traced his fingers over his father's name, feeling the cold metal warm slowly under his touch. Around him, the forest swayed in the wind, the same rhythm it had carried for generations. He closed his eyes, listening to it. The whisper of leaves, the distant rush of water, the sound of life continuing. When he opened them again, the sun had dipped low, painting the trees in gold. He turned to leave, pausing only once to look back. The plaques glowed softly in the fading light, the forest holding them like a promise. He drove home with the windows down, the air cool and clean. Somewhere along the way he began to hum, an old tune his father used to whistle while fixing engines, a melody that belonged to another time but still carried through the years. By the time he reached the outskirts of the city, the last of the daylight had vanished, and the road ahead shimmered under the glow of streetlights. He didn't know what waited beyond the next turn, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of what came next. The silence, once his enemy, had become his witness. It carried everything that mattered, the truth, the loss, and the faint, steady pulse of something like peace. And as the hills faded behind him, Marcus Ellery drove on, the echoes of the past finally quiet, the road before him open and endless. If this story got you hooked, don't stop here. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you never miss what's coming next. Check out my other videos for more stories that will keep you on the edge till the very end. And if this one made you think, share it with someone who needs to see it.